Good evening. Thanks so much for everybody joining. Welcome to the meeting for the Research Triangle PowerShell user group. My name's Phil Bossman. We're so happy that you decided to join us this evening. This evening we have Dave Goldman, who's going to talk to us about the inner workings and the funny playing with PowerShell objects. And Dave, I want to simply ask you, how you're doing, and how did you get into some of what you've been playing with in PowerShell? Tell me a little about yourself.
All right, well, I'm doing well. Thank you, Phil, Mike, for having me speak tonight. I've a little bit about myself. I've been at Microsoft for 20 years. I've held various different roles. CSS, I was customer facing, went to the escalation side of the house, and then went to the development group, and then recently, about 7 years ago, came back to public facing. And I've, in some way, shape, or form, I've been involved with PowerShell since it was created, but, I've only used it at times that I've needed to for myself. In the last 2 years, I started getting very, very serious about it. I started working side by side with some of the devs as mentors, working on checking in bugs to PowerShell, and there were some things that I came across that I found pretty interesting. One of the things that I do on a routine basis for my customer or coworkers is that they will have requests from their customers on, hey, we're working with these data types and we're trying to format these. There's just too much information here. How do we cut this down without losing any information, or how do we see what we want to? And a little bit about myself, I'm a tinkerer, so I really love to dig into stuff. So the best place for me to go was into the PowerShell source code and debug it and see how it worked, figure it out. And that's what I did. And that's what I kind of do with all the topics that, if I don't know something, I want to know it 100%.
So is that your background with, more like a CS background to understand some of the coding, or is some of this stuff is pretty, for those who are not so much CS based or computer science based, they don't understand that they can really get into this?
You can. A little now. A lot of people don't realize I don't actually have a college degree. I'm self-taught. So when I first got into IT 25 years ago, I started with my MCSE. I started taking certification exams and started working my way up. And I always had a passion for creating things, which led to development. There's always, I think people find in IT or CS that there's a million programs, but they never do exactly what you want them to do. So that kind of sparked my interest in creating things that I needed. And that led me down the code path. And then through work, that gave me a greater path for escalation and growth and learning. So I started working towards becoming a principal escalation engineer, which basically meant that I was debugging problems for a living. So I'd get a problem and I'm in the code and debugging it all day, looking for the bug and working with the product group. And so, if you really have a deep passion for that, there's always a place to start, and you can do it. If I could do it, anybody could do it.
So tonight is about, I'm assuming, since I don't know the core material other than some of the stuff we discussed, this is people are probably used to gathering data in PowerShell and not realizing that once they get the data, they can manipulate it and turn it around into other things. And maybe some of that is sort of unknown to people. Is that a sort of a good summary of what tonight is about?
Yeah, and I'm going to put that up on the screen. I just put the About Speaker slide up here. It has my GitHub link, it has my LinkedIn link, and my Twitter. So if anybody wants to contact me through the group or after to talk about this, or maybe like, my career, because you have aspirations to get into CS or, IT, feel free to reach out to me. But moving along to the topic. So what I'm going to talk about is PowerShell objects. Just a brief overview, like what is an object? What happens when you ask PowerShell to do something for you? What happens when we send it down the pipeline, right? Because there's different actions that we can take on that data, which results in the manipulation of the objects in whether we create new objects, view what we have, destroy them, whatever. And then I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper about the formatting process on how the PowerShell formatting engine goes through the selection process to figure out what it needs to display. And then I have a couple demos that basically show you extending types, because PowerShell is an extensive type. You can basically take an object and convert it into something else by adding, properties and methods and so forth to it. So we do a little bit, we'll do a little bit of that, and then I'll show you how to do this on the fly, but then I'll also show you how to do it as if you create your own module, because the processes are a little bit different. And then I've got the source code breakpoints for you guys. So if you're adventurous and you want to go into PowerShell source code and debug it, you just need to download that from GitHub, and you can set these breakpoints, build it, and then you can play around with it yourself.
It sounds like you have a lot of content to cover.
Yeah, I could do it in an hour.
So listen, take your time, do what you do. We're excited to see it. We should probably hand it over to you. Thanks for speaking tonight. And ladies and gentlemen, enjoy. We're going to hand it over to Dave.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Mike. And guys, by all means, I want to second what Mike and Phil were saying. I know how to do stuff on how I do it internally. I would love to see if you guys, do this type of stuff out in your neck of the woods. So if you do, and you have, something to add, please, share it with me. I'm very interested to see how, other engineers are manipulating their data. And that would be great. And I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna get started. So in PowerShell, when we talk about objects, PowerShell works on objects, and everything is an object. We have to have some sort of tangible component to work with. These objects have different components of metadata. They have methods, they have properties, events, and metadata. The methods allow you to take an action on that object. The properties, you can store data. Those are your variables. You can subscribe to events. And the metadata are, information about the object types and so forth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over here and restart my environment real quick. And I'm going to...
Can we ask you to blow that up a little bit? It looks a little small on the Teams.
We do this. Let me see.
Take your time.
Trying to figure out the best way to do it here in Teams.
Control plus.
That is not working, surprisingly enough.
There you go.
Did that work?
There we go.
Yeah.
I had to Control Shift on this. So and if you can see here, like everything that I have in my environment is automated. I have various different connection points through my profile that I connect to, and as Mike was saying and Phil were saying earlier, with Justin having an add-in for Secret Vault. If you don't play around with Secret Vault, it is very, very cool. I use it to connect to Azure Vault as well as Secure Vault locally. Really takes the having to convert encrypted files for passwords and stuff. It really cuts those down, which is pretty cool. So if you get a chance, definitely download that and play around with that.
I would love to talk to you about the Azure Key Vault connection. I didn't know that you could do that with the secrets management. So for another time.
Yeah, and actually there is, I think it's Ignacio. There's another MVP, and I'll paste it in the meeting after. Did a presentation on that with Azure Vault and breaks everything down in screenshots. Is really, really cool.
Awesome.
Let me let me see if I can get it here real quick. There it's in Go. All right, I'll grab it from his page, as I bookmarked it, but not to.
I'll take a look while you're doing your thing.
Yeah, pretty cool. So, all right, so let me minimize this region. So, for example, if I run git process runs and it spits out all this horrific stuff to the screen, and you're like, what is this? So by default, I'm just going to run this, and I'm just going to grab a process real quick. And by default, in my code, you see that I've selected just the first object. Okay. What this is this is if I'm going to take this object and I'm going to pass it down the pipeline to get member, and I'll just use regular verb and nouns for those that are not familiar with the aliases. And you'll see on this object that when it was created, the type name for this is system.diagnostic.process. There is a hierarchical structure within PowerShell where all objects start their manifestation from a .NET object. And each one of these have different views, and in several other presentations I've been asked to show this. But just for get process, for an example, if I run this, you'll see that there's 92 items that are on that object. If you were unfamiliar, there's a switch called force. I use this all the time, and you'll notice that if you dump that out, you'll notice there's 167 items that are on that object that you typically wouldn't see. And a lot of them start with underscores, and you can actually see the methods for sets, the gets, and finally, static members. There's only 10 of those, and these are ones that are inherited from the .NET object itself that you can see. So if I was to actually go onto this process, I could call start or new. So this is what PowerShell does for every object. Now, these are different when you make remote calls, because in certain situations, you have something called serialization and deserialization, where you're taking information from one system and you're passing it to another, and you have to reconstruct that metadata. But for now, that's another topic. We're just going to stick with just local objects, and the reason for this is this is where the formatting comes in. So if I go back to my process and I run get member, and what I'm doing here is I'm just doing where the object name is like PS, and I want to pull back all of the PS metadata. And you'll notice that there's some member sets, we have some property sets, and a code property. The two that we're focusing on here is the PS type names, because this is where you can actually see the birth of this object and what it gets converted to, and then the PS standard member set. This is a default display property set. It's on every object, and this is what the PowerShell formatting engine is looking for when it wants to format objects. So if I dump out the type names, you can see that this object originally was a system object. It was marshaled by reference, goes through the component model, and ends up as a system.diagnostic process. So this kind of helps you understand what that object morphed into. And then the second one, which is more important, and by all means, if you're not familiar with objects, or you haven't really dug into them, the one tip that I could give you is, and you can do this for hours, create an object. It could be a basic object. It could be a string. So if I just do $A equals Dave.
So can I ask you a question quickly? It's just like with the type names and stuff like that, so that kind of like I'm like deer with the headlights look, and just like, do I need to know, like, why is that valuable to me? Or should I know this information? And
yeah, that is very, very good question. Yes, the type names are very important for a couple of reasons. Number one, most important, is what type of object are you actually working with? So in the regards of remoting, if I was to do a get mailbox in Exchange, and I'm expecting a certain type of object to come back with the data, and maybe it's unmarshaled, I may end up with a different constructed object, which then changes my views, and it also changes the information that I thought that I had, opposed to what I do have. The second portion of that, and we'll see this later in the demo, is you can create custom objects in PowerShell, and you will give them a name. So, and that's where the PS type names comes from. That custom name that you call it, like Dave's object or whatever, that's what gets stamped on the object, and that's what PowerShell is actually looking for, as well as, basically, okay, what type names are on this object? What type of view can I generate for this object, and does that view exist? And you'll see that in the next couple slides.
So just jumping in there for a second. So I like to keep things at the basic level because I know there's a lot of people that get lost with some of the deeper stuff. So you started off talking about objects, and one of the things about PowerShell that's great is that everything is quote unquote an object. And then you showed get member, and you showed the type. And what may not be apparent to some people is while everything in PowerShell is an object, there are different types of objects. And one of the wonderful things about PowerShell is based on those objects, PowerShell will make some suggestions for you based on the type of object that something is. Oh, I see you have object A. You probably want these methods and these properties and these views. So what I think you're going to be talking about is how to get away from some of those default things later on to do what you want to get away from some of the preferences that PowerShell sets, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to create our own, we're going to add our own name to it. We're going to create our own view, and we're going to feed that to PowerShell to give us what we want to see.
Yeah. So PowerShell's trying to do a lot of work for us and help us out by saying, when I get certain objects, I already know I have to present certain things to the user. Dave is going to show us later on about how we can take that even farther to say, well, maybe you don't want the help that PowerShell's giving you. Maybe you want to do your own custom stuff. So I just wanted to give that as sort of like a lead in, because that may have gone over some people's heads there.
No, and I totally appreciate that. I actually will show a visual representation of that and break that down. This was just the high level, but that's definitely a great segment.
Cool.
And going back to the objects, one thing that I would recommend if you're not familiar with the type names or some of the things is anytime you have an object and you want to know more about it, you can always send that down to the pipeline to get member, and get member will always give you a display like this. And this will show you that, I created a string, and it's showing that for this type, it's a string. It will show you all of the methods that are available for the string class. All of these can be looked at MSDN. These are all of the methods that you can, do off of an object. Like, for example, if I wanted to split an object that had multiple characters and so forth. So definitely dig around in that, and you will find a wealth of information. The second property is the reference to property names, and I'm going to show more of a visual representation of this on what PowerShell is doing, but this is the default display property set. For objects that are created in PowerShell, as Mike had stated, PowerShell tries to do all the work for you. So in this case, we have asked PowerShell to give us a process object, and by default, there's a view associated with this. And what that view is this. So we, the PowerShell dev team stated that when we, at creation, we want to show these 5 properties: ID, handle, CPU, system information, and name. So when you actually dump out that object, this is the view that's being constructed for you. And so I'll show you a little bit about this. Now, Mike, I'm going to break this down. Does anybody have questions about the get member or just the 2 properties that are on there? Because I would love to chat about that for a second if someone has some questions.
Well, I think it's the question that I think some people would have would be not so much direct is almost, I think you're going to get to it, and I think you'll be fine. That's why I don't want to ask the question, but is what was the value in knowing that information? Is that, hey, yeah, here's some information that I have, and here's where I can get the default member sets, and I can figure out what types it is. But if I'm doing some of that, it's like at least personally for me, it's like, where do those pieces put together so that I can get some value out of that?
Yeah, the value add for that is the type name is what links your object to the view, and the default display property set is the basic values that PowerShell is going to display, which I'm going to show you here with the pipeline.
So I
You
think
type in it.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
So I guess what you're saying really is if you're trying to get different information back out of the objects you're currently looking at, is that there may be an opportunity for different views, and there may be opportunities to create custom objects or convert the objects you're given into your own custom objects to then keep it into the views you want, and then also the typesets and some magic beyond that, right? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, 100%.
Okay.
I think one of the frustrating things for me from time to time is when I pull back data sometimes and I do go look at get member, it comes back as a different object than I expected sometimes. So I have an Active Directory focus, and sometimes it'll come back as an Active Directory object, and sometimes it'll come back as string objects if I strip out too many properties and I just have like name and description for example, or something like that. So that's when I find like get member is useful, because once I know it's a string object versus an AD object or something else, then I know that there's certain things that I can do with it based on just experience from things in the past.
Yeah, and Mike, one thing to add to that, the basic default behavior of PowerShell is it's always going to return a collection, whether it's going to be one element starting at element 0. For those that are just maybe new to PowerShell, 0 is always your first element. But if you strip too many out or you create a new object, that scalar object's still going to be put in a collection. So you could end up returning and seeing a system.string for that instead of an AD user. And that was one of the reasons why I kind of went down this road, because I would run into that a lot in the past working with mailbox objects and address lists. All right,
Yeah.
so so go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, and added to that is one of the things that I find is that certain commandlets, or even, I deal with AD stuff, and I also do with like VMware stuff, and because the commandlets sometimes request a different, they work differently based upon the object type coming in. And so if it is like a VM object, or is it an AD object itself, it's an AD object, the actual class AD object, then it does different things. And so, but if I send in a string, it acts differently, and it puts the properties in the different places. And so that's also kind of the magic behind of what PowerShell does. And so that's sometimes what I'm really trying to focus on, what kind of objects I'm working with, is so that the next commandlet down the line can automatically, parse the information I'm looking for. Is that, hey, it's expecting, a credential object, so it will put it into the right property type. It will do all those stuff for me, just because I'm using the proper type that the next command is actually looking for. So I think that's valuable.
Awesome. Yeah, and here you'll get to see that a little bit here. So with objects in mind, in the example that you're looking at on the screen right here, we have a pipeline set up. So what I'm running, I'm asking PowerShell to get process. It is going to create a process object for me. That object is going to retain the data that was pulled back from the system, which would be the system processes. And we're going to send this along to the second pipe. And what we're doing is we're asking PowerShell, filter this. So where the object has handles that are greater than 50, filter all of those out. And then we're going to pass this down to the sort command. And we're going to say sort them in the value of name and handles. And then we're asking PowerShell to format this in a table display for us. So what that looks like in PowerShell, just so you can see it, And so this is what it did. And now, just for edification purposes, in PowerShell, you'll denote where object is, where it has the squirrely brackets. If you're asking for just one parameter, then you don't need to use those. And so that's why kind of in my command, it looked just a little bit different. And then you can see the table that was split out. So what's happening here is I asked for this information, and we ended up getting this back in return. Now, for the visual representation, what's happening is we hit enter. The PowerShell parser takes all of this information and says, what are you as the user asking for me? It will run get process. It will go and now give it to where object, and we work on each individual request. Now, this is where the magic comes in. Out default and out host. This is where you, as the end user, would see the information displayed on the screen. Now, going back to the questions of what I was asked earlier is what is the importance and relevance of the type names and the property sets. This is where it comes in handy. So we ran a command, get process. Created a diagnostic process. It holds the information. As you saw, we passed it down the pipeline. Now, at the very end, before it gets to the screen, there's a command called out default. In the background, PowerShell adds that to every object before it's outputted, and there's two things that out default does. The first thing is it's responsible for communicating with the PowerShell formatting engine to look up views, and then it will send the output to the host. That's the console. What happens behind the scenes is that there's 4 checks that happen. The formatting engine first looks to see if there's a predefined view associated with the object. I'm going to show you that in a little bit. For system process or get service or anything that has to do with operating system commandlets, the PowerShell team has created a default view, which you kind of saw before for get process, where it's only showing you handles and working set, ID, process name. If there is no predefined view, then what PowerShell is going to do is look up to see if there's a user-defined view, one that you have created using 2 different PowerShell XML files, which I'll show after. This is where the type names comes in, where you're tying your custom object to that view. This tells PowerShell, hey, we had a predefined view, but I want to show my view. If there's no user-defined view, then what happens is PowerShell goes to the default, which is the default display property set, and it looks to see if there was one defined there. If there's not, then PowerShell just does its absolute best and says, hey, I'm going to give you a table, and if there's too much information, it's going to give you a list, and it's just going to spit the list out to the screen, which is what you saw here. And PowerShell just dumped all of this stuff out in a list. Now, it formatted in the list that I wanted, but this is kind of clunky to work with. This is a little bit difficult, to work with. Now, there is one more thing that I wanted to point out when it comes to formatting lists and objects that have a lot of information in them. This is a property. It's a preference property called format enumeration limit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this text file here. But if you guys want to see the link for that, anyone that's not familiar with this is in the PS Home ENUS directory. These are where your help files are. And there's one called About Preferences. And these are the default preferences that PowerShell uses when you start up a PowerShell session. And this will show you all of the default values. This format for enumeration is by default set to 4. So what that looks like is earlier when I started my lab, I ran a couple commands. And for example, here in my lab, I pulled back an object per job. This is for mailboxes. But you'll notice if you look at the address list membership, it has these 3 dots denoted, which is basically telling me that there's more information there. This is just another way for you to control collection sizes depending on how much data is coming back, so you can cut down. Here, I'm going to just change it to 15 and run the same command, and you'll notice now I have a lot more information. This value is per session. So every time you start up a new session, that's the default, unless you go into your PowerShell profile and you decide to set up the preferences where you want to have it always enumerate 15 or more, because you want to see all of the data and know what you're working with, and then you can start to cut it down from there.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think this is awesome what you're doing. The slide that you had up prior, I think one of the awesome things about PowerShell is that what you're showing here is what so many people struggle to sort of understand, how things get passed along. And as you get more experience with PowerShell, we understand these processes better. One of the great things about PowerShell is you can kind of get started on day one without knowing any of this crap and get kind of far. That's the cool thing about it. But as you dig in more, you really understand how these pieces work together and really start to understand there's a lot more you can do when we start to pick apart the processes. That was an excellent representation of how that works behind the scenes. That was awesome.
Yeah, PowerShell, if you ask for it, it will give it to you. You can get overwhelmed really quickly. So now, are there any other questions on that? Because what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to jump into the views, like how the views are constructed, what are the files that back them. I'm going to show you an example of the system process, which we've been working with.
I think we're good. I think everybody's waiting for more. They're loving this.
All right, cool. So now here's the flexibility and the power behind PowerShell. You have the flexibility to create and extend any objects that you want. There are 2 files that are with PowerShell, okay? These are MAML XML files. These are the XML format that's used for PowerShell Online. The MAML stands for Microsoft Assistance Markup Language. If anybody cares to know more about that, just look up MAML on, you can get right to the Wikipedia. But for tonight's sake, there's 2 files that PowerShell uses. There's a types ps1.xml. This is what allows you to extend your objects, and you have a format ps1.xml. This is the file that's going to define how your objects are displayed.
Question?
Yeah, go for it.
So is it ps1.xml or ps1.xml?
ps1.xml.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So now for the formats, there's 4 different views that you can create. You can create a table, you can create a list. It could be wide or it can be custom. Now, one thing to note about this is that the types file allows you to extend it with additional properties. You can add aliases to that. You can add script blocks which say, I want you to pull the name from this, and if name equals this, do that, display this message. The formats only affect the properties that were passed down the pipeline or how they were passed. So with regards to the example before, we said get all the processes, and we asked PowerShell to construct us a view. We said, look for all of the ones that are greater than 50 and sort them by name and by handle count and give us a table. We didn't throw anything away, but at the same time, PowerShell gave us everything. Now, one thing I want to stress, and it's really important to do this, you never want to update these core files. They are signed, they're digitally signed, and they will destroy your PowerShell environment if you make any changes to these files directly. what you always want to do is use a template from one of them, which I'll show you how to do, and it's super simple. And with beginning of PowerShell 6, these are the type files are no longer shipped with PowerShell. They are actually compiled into PowerShell. So if you're using, Windows PowerShell or using Windows Terminal and you have different PowerShell sessions, just be aware of that, where if you fire up 5.1 and you're creating a custom view, but you can't find them in 6 or above, we didn't get rid of them. They're just part of PowerShell now. And if you want to take a look at those real quick, I'll just give you guys a quick second. What you can do is, let me pull my environment back up. Let me just clear the host. You can do a get child item or GCI, which is the alias. And you can go to the PS home and you'll see, here's the formats files. So the PowerShell team was gracious enough to ship different formatting views for certificate information, diagnostics, .NET types, and this goes all the way down. And if I look for the type files, you'll see that there's just a couple here. The .NET types, get event, which is just generic, and then types. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to crack 2 of these open. And again, for anyone that's not familiar with aliases, the II is invoke item. It's just a fast way to open up an element. I could have also, instead of using II, could have just put Notepad there. But I wanted this to open up in Notepad++ because it has the color formatting, which makes it a little bit easier to see. So going back to the process that we were looking at before, the get process object, if I look at the type and I do a search for process, here's the Win32 process. So I'm searching down in PowerShell file, and I want to see, say again?
Just zoom it up a little bit.
Oh, sorry about
That's good.
that. Okay, cool. Here's a Win32 process, and here's system process. So now I'm going to split screen this real quick. When we were talking about the type names before, why this is important, is you can always look up the type name of the object that you're trying to find. So in this case, I have the name and I can go back and look in that type file and I can say, hey, I've got the correct object. And so now, taking a look at this, I can see that there is a PS standard member set, and the PowerShell team has in fact created a custom view. And by default, we'll always show the ID, handles, CPU, SI, system information, and name. And then if I look over at the format, how are we going to display this to the screen? You can kind of see here from the XML format that we have an object. It's called process, and you want a view selected by. This is if you remember before, the PS type names, here's the type name. And I'm going to show you how to do this when we construct our own, where we're actually going to construct it. But you can start, I'm hoping that everyone can see how this kind of fits together now with the type name and using the view get member, where you can see, okay, now I ran get process and I did find a default display property set. And I also found that we have a view. And so for this view, you can see that we're doing a table control. And for the labels, here's handle. We want that column to be 7 characters in width, and we are aligning it to the right. And you can kind of see what this table looks like. And here's all the elements that are in that table. So by default, if there was no view here, you would only get these 5. Since we have a view, we're going to display all of these because that's what PowerShell found, and that's what it gives us back. So that's exactly what you see when you see that.
So you're saying, so I just to make sure that I kind of understand that concept there, is because they're the default types there, it would return those 3 properties. But because we're also requesting a view of it, it's actually using the format instead of the type. So if I just dump that out to a file, like out file, then I would only get those 5 properties. I wouldn't get all this other stuff.
You would get the view, you would get all of these because those are what is in contained in the object. Now, one thing I should mention is everyone here familiar with select object?
Mm-hmm.
Try not to use it if you don't have to. And the reason why is because if you ever use select object, what you're doing is you're asking PowerShell to just give you what you were looking for, and it discards the rest of the information. So if I went here and I said get process, and then I did a pipe to select object where I only wanted the name and handles, it would toss everything out. In your out file, you would only have just those 2. So this is the format for the table, and the type is going to display the default if there's no view. So you have a fallback.
But out file would give you no view because there's no view to out file. It's the raw data, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you,
but those are the
can you take
properties
another
you get.
approach on that? Because I'm not understanding that.
And which portion? The question or the explanation?
The suggestion.
So my suggestion would always be to have a view. You can tell PowerShell that you want to have a default property set displayed for a particular object. So in this case, there's a lot of properties on process, but I only want the default to be displayed. So I could remove this view. I could cut out this process, system.diagnostic process, from the format file. And when I ask for get process, what would happen is that PowerShell will go through the selection process and say, okay, is there a formatted view? Oh, no, this stuff doesn't exist. Then it will look for a fallback and say, is there just a default that I can display? And in here, we've referenced just these. So then in that case, without the view, PowerShell is going to be instructed to display just the defaults that it was told about. So you have a multi-tiered approach. You can create a view, but you can also say, I want a display set. And I'm going to also show this to you in how it works, and you can do this on your screen like along with me. So like you can actually see it work.
So I think with respect to your suggestion and what Dennis was asking, because I often do what you say, again, from an AD focus, AD comes back with 10 default properties if you're looking up like a user or a computer, and sometimes I just want the names, right, just for a quick view. But I guess the takeaway here is that whenever it's select object, you're basically forcing PowerShell to go to a custom view because
Yes.
it's going to always throw away the default because it's never going to have enough data to match the type or the format.
Yeah, if you ever do select object, you're instructing PowerShell to throw away everything that you didn't ask for. So that's why my suggestion is to not use it if you don't have to, because if you didn't save that information, if you didn't save that object to JSON or XML or even to Notepad after you retrieved it, like say for example, you're doing a long database call, you waited 15 minutes for the object, you didn't save it, and now you have the object and you say, I'm going to ask PowerShell via pipeline to do select object and just give me name and ID. It's going to construct a new custom object in the background, and it's going to populate that with the name and ID, and that's the object that you're going to get. And then you may exited your session and realized I don't have access to the object anymore. I just threw away all of the data that I that I could have used after for something else. So I'm just kind of throwing that out just to, give some hindsight for maybe some of the newer guys that read some of the literature out there and you see, hey, select object, just to be aware that when you create a view, you still have all of the information there. It's just not constructed in the view. It's hidden in the background on the object. Whereas select object, you're throwing it away.
Well, I think the only place that wouldn't hold true is if you did select star, but then why would you do select? Probably, right? Because
Right.
you're saying pass everything from the pipeline. So Dennis, I think Dennis is still missing. All we're saying here, Dennis, is that when you do something like get process or get child item or get item or get AD user, it's going to come back with a default view. That view is going to come based on the members that are in that view, right? So the properties that came back when you said get AD user or get child item, and it's going to look up that object type and it's going to say, does all these things match? Oh, I know what basic format to display the data as. When you go select object, what happens is you're just basically going off the plan now. And it might work, it might not. If you cut too much data away and it doesn't match anything in the type or the format, then it's going to go to the lowest common denominator. It's going to say, well, I'm just going to give the best view I can based on what data you gave me. So if it's 2 fields, I'll do a list. If it's more fields, I'll do a table. I got that backwards, but does that make sense, Dennis?
Got it. Thank you.
And then, so we had a question in the chat. I don't know if you're able to see the chat, but Jason was curious what the format files look like for Get Windows feature.
Yeah, they're not in here for for PowerShell Core. I think that's exclusive to Windows to PowerShell, but I'll look that up. I'll get that to Jason and figure out where they have that stored.
And I'm guessing Jason's asking that because that is just a really interesting output when you see Get Windows feature, the way that they have the indentations and the checkboxes and stuff.
Yeah, and you can create custom. These you can get pretty elaborate with these. The ones that I'm just showing tonight, these are just basic table and list, but you can, if you want to get fancy and putting HTML objects in XML and having it rendered, you can get pretty elaborate. I'll see if I can track that one down and get that one back to the group.
But maybe a simple solution when, for example, mailbox sizes, you see those in kilobytes or megabytes, how those are formatted in this PS1 XML file.
Some of those are actually handled in the C# code in the background when the object is being constructed and being served back to you. So if you actually look in the PowerShell source code, there are some formats in there where you'll see like, bytes divided by 1,000, they have the calculations that are in there, and then the object is serialized back. So some of those won't be in the views. The views are more for just constructing what you want to see on the screen. Let me see if I can find an example.
I have seen that I got the number when I, for example, use this select only that kind of property, and then I see that this is using bytes, but when I using something like this, it goes to those XML files, then they show a little bit different kind of information.
Yeah, that
kilobytes or something like that.
Yeah, that you can do, and I have an example of that, and I will show you how to do that. It's here. This is like one example, but if you're looking on an event log entry, when you're formatting the table, you can actually put code in here. So they're using a formatting string for this. I have other examples in mind. So like here. So you can do that by achieving that with a script block. So when you construct your view, you can put a script block, you can put any code you want, and what it would do is it will take the information that was passed down and format that for you. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. All right. So I think this will help if we'll jump, put it on the screen so you can see it. So procedurally, there's a couple different ways that you can extend these objects. One is with add member, another one is with update type data and update format data. So let me put this up here. So, all right, I'm going to give you an example. So I'm going to clear out the screen, and I'm going to create, I hope everybody's familiar with PS custom object. If you're not, what a PS custom object is a custom object. I'm basically creating a hash table full of values, and I'm asking PowerShell to go and create this for me. So I have now a variable called my custom object, and I dump it out, and we can see there's no fuse, there's no defaults for this. We have more than 4 properties here, so it just spits out a list. I could.
Hey, I have a quick question.
That's a quick question.
So my question is, well, yeah, if you create an object, how come the formatting is different now that you have it? So yeah, when you create an object, it comes out as a format table like you've done. But
by default, it comes out as a list because there's just too many properties. If there were only, say, 2 properties on this, it would display it as a list. So I actually asked PowerShell to display it in a format table for me.
thank you.
Yep. Oh, and Phil actually found the file for Jason. If you're looking for the Windows format feature file, it's in Windows System 32, Windows PowerShell v1 modules server manager.
Yeah, it took me a while to get it, but I found it.
Yeah, and the formats that are in there are going to be for Windows, and you'll see they're by component. This one's in Server Manager. The ones that you see here, those are for Windows PowerShell Core and PowerShell. So, all right, so going back to my example, now we're here, what we're going to do is we're actually going to construct a view. All right, so let me clear the host, and I'm going to step you guys through, and hopefully this will demystify some of the stuff that I was talking about before. So the first thing I want to do is I want to dump out my object, and I'm looking at a type name, and I can see that this is an automation PS custom object. So I gave it a hash table of values. I said first name, last name, date, which I just did a little formatting on there. And this is what PowerShell gave me. It gave me back an object that has some methods to it. And the member types are note properties. And these note properties are containing my data. Okay. Now, if I use the force command, as I did earlier, you'll start to see those PS type names, the extended. You'll notice that there is no here default display property set as there was on the get process. And there's a reason for that, because I just created this as a custom object, very basic, and I'm going to dump out the PS type names. Okay, so I can see that this was a .NET object, and I've extended it, which becomes a PS custom object because I have just added some notes to it. So how do we actually extend this to get this ready to create our own view? There's 3 ways to do this. If I create a custom object, you'll notice up here, I did not on purpose add a PS type names. So if you notice down here, this object just has its PS custom object, doesn't have anything custom about it. I'm going to create a new, whoops, sorry about that. I'm going to create a new object. This will be called my custom object 1, and I added this field, PS type name. Now you can see right here, I've added my own custom type name to this object. I've given it this, and essentially I've given this object a name. That's the first way to do it. If I have my custom object up here where I did not add that, so maybe I'm working with Mike or Phil or someone, and they sent me this object in their code and they're like, hey, we need you to do some work. We need a custom view, but they didn't extend it. What I can do is I can take that custom object and I can call add member, and I can pass in the type name parameter and add my custom object. And then if I go to dump this out, you'll notice here it is on my custom object. And my custom object did not contain that before. And then there's the third way. If I was to create a custom object, say number 3.
Sorry to interrupt just there.
Yeah.
If you had created a PS custom object, say something around get process, could you, and it didn't have a type, could you add a type of an existing thing like system.process?
You can. What I have seen in testing that is if your type name is on there and the type name is first in that list, what'll happen is PowerShell will look up. And so let me take a step back. Yes, it will find it. When you start PowerShell and PowerShell creates that local session for you, it reads those type files, the PS1, the types PS1 XML and the format PS1 XML, and it creates a custom types and format cache table. So now if I added that system.diagnostic process to my own custom object, when PowerShell goes through that selection process, it will see if there's a custom predetermined view, and it'll say, oh, looks at the type names and says, wait, this has system.diagnostic process. It will look up that view and print that. That's the view you'll get to the screen.
So this is blowing my mind that we can have multiple types on an object. I don't think I've ever seen that before. I mean, what if you've got 2 different types on an object, 2 different format files for each type? It just finds the first one it enumerates, or what's the deal?
Yeah, and you'll notice here, and I'll show you. I was going to show you this later on, but I'll show it to you now. In my custom project here, all of my custom objects are associated with that PS type name. So here I have one for PS utilities job, and then I could scroll down. You'll see that I have some custom code. This is script block that I've basically added to say if the character length is greater than 15, display ... And as I scroll down, you'll notice now I have one for sessions. You can add multiple, and the recommendation is always to have one format file, but you can create multiple views for your objects. It can get a little bit hairy, but you just got to be careful with what you want to show, because you can have a custom view. You may want to create just a table. You may just want to have a default for different objects. I have seen the recommendation internally create one view for one object just to keep it simple. I have tried to create multiple views and have run into issues because later on I've come back to the code and I'm like, why is it doing that? And forgot that I, have updated the code and maybe took out a type name and it was displaying a different something that I didn't expect. So, best practice, I would say create one view for your custom object, and whatever you pick, whether it's a table, custom list, just run with that.
So I understand. I think I understand what you're saying, but I'm wondering if we're I'm wondering if maybe I don't, because maybe we're talking about two different things, or maybe we are talking about the same thing. Like, I get the idea behind multiple views for an object type. I'm getting lost on multiple types for an object and how that's.
The multiple types is just the extension of the object. Those can exist without any problems. Where the link between the view is specifically for if a view matches the PS type name. So you're not going to have. Let me dump this object out real quick.
So are you really saying it's like it's almost like the inheritance process of, it's a system prop, it's a system, then it becomes a string, then it becomes a char and all the kind of stuff. And it's effectively just an array, and it goes down, it goes into the queue, and then it pops them off the queue in that order too. So you had your system object, and you called it my custom, and then you called it my custom one. So if you have a you can do something with custom object one, well, it'll take that. But if it doesn't know anything about system object one, but it does know something about system object, it'll pick up system object. So you can kind of like tier them, and then it'll just pick up the first one it sees from the popping of the array.
Correct. Yes. PowerShell has to give you back something,
and so it'll just go down the list until it finds one.
Right.
Yeah.
And eventually you're going to get to a system object, which is a .NET object, and it's just going to say, here you go. Most likely, that's going to be a PS custom object, because the way the PowerShell is designed for system stuff like get process, get system, and, get Windows feature and other things, there are built-in types associated with those objects. For example, if you we'll just do a simple one. I did this one before, just hopefully this will demonstrate it. So I created a simple string, right? And I do get member. Let me do PS type names. You'll notice that this is a system string, but it's also an object, right? There is a type defined for a string, and so it's going to show you that. Now, if I strip that off, this will obviously print out an object, but it's most likely may give you something that you didn't expect.
So another way to think about this is string is a type of object, right? So when you looked at the previous examples, when we were talking about multiple types or multiple types on an object, they're really subtypes, right? There's the broad category, and then, like Phil said, string, and then a char, and we're really narrowing down to getting to more specific types in most of these cases. And I think what you're saying is it's going to match on the most specific type, and if it doesn't, it's just going to keep falling back to a more generic format.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can you pipe my custom object to get member real quick? It only showed my custom object.
Right. Now here's the thing though. This is why I mentioned to always use force.
What?
Because then you see the ones that are hidden. And then if I was to use static, which you typically wouldn't see, these are the only two methods that were inherited from via inheritance on the .NET object itself.
So it's putting them still in a subproperty of PS type names. There's that top one of type name just shows, I guess, the first one, the very top above your table.
Yes. Yeah.
So
That's kind of, it's showing you that is correct. It is showing you just the first one.
So I think it's in like inceptionist type. It's like that's a view of the object type view. It's kind of a crazy, So it's just the last one, but it's just the type name of whatever just happens to be the last one. But all of them are in the type name.
Yes, they all get populated here. And then you can even dig down. You could look at the base. You can, even if you look at, like, for example, PS extended, just to give you an idea, I can look at what I've extended on this object to make it a custom object.
So wait, those are just the properties that you added to the original property?
Yes. Yep. As note properties. So first name, last name, which you'll see here if I scroll up. So for my custom object, these were the fields, the properties, and the values that I added. And we will store those in the PS extended parameter.
I agree with Phil.
Huh.
It's so interesting to see how this stuff goes together. I've just run these commands and really taken a lot of this information for granted. Didn't know half of this stuff was there.
Amen.
There's a lot. I mean, like let's go back to my reference before where I was suggesting, and I do this quite often. I run get member on everything, and then I run it on every individual property that's on there, and it dumps out a lot of stuff so you can actually see it. Now, the one thing to remember with get member, and I don't know how known this is, but I'll let you know anyway. If you have a collection, and this has 3 elements in it, right? See that there's 3. If I run get member on this, by default, get member is going to show me that it's a system int 32, right? What you want to do is, if you want to see all of the elements, this is and I should say, let me take that back. This is a collection of int 32s, but if I wanted to, you can either put a comma in front of it, which tells get member to do not flatten the collection. The second way to do this is if I do get member and I do an input object. That's the other way to do it. And so what it's doing is it shows me that this is actually an object. Okay. I can dump out the object. Let me go back the other way. Then I can see that there's some other stuff on here. So I can see that it's PS type. It's been extended to have count. And, now you can see the methods for an array. So I can add to this. I can clear it. I can say, does it contain something? So when you run get member, just kind of, be aware that when you run get member knows that it's a collection. Everything you get, that object's always a collection, whether it has one element or has multiple elements. Here, this is another way to do it. So if I do, all right, now I have a collection that has multiple, if I actually add it, has multiple types to it. So let me clear this out. Did you guys see just what happened there?
No.
So I have
yeah.
I have a string, and I added 1, 2, 3, so three ints, and I added a string or a char to it. I ran get member. Get member shows the first element, int 32, right? Because there was 3 of them, and then it shows me the system string. It flattens the collection.
So it figured it out for you that there's multiple types within the collection.
Yep. PowerShell goes through the parser, and then it'll starts to work on those objects, and it enumerates it. It says, okay, what's here? PowerShell's job, main job in my mind, is to take a look and inspect every single object, figure out what's there. Does it need to be casted or not from one type to another? For those that are not familiar with casting, it's basically when you take an object and you change it to another type. So if I was to do, say, for example, A equals 1, I can see that A is an int. Now, if I follow PowerShell's parsing rules for using quotes and single quotes, I'm still typing in the same thing, but PowerShell knows now, based on the 2 single quotes, that was not a number, it was a string. And so now when I get member, it shows me, hey, what's there. And that's what's happening when we're constructing these views. We're just saying, is there a type name on here? Yes. Is that type name in the format table cache? Yes. Great. Let's display it.
I'm first time seeing this comma stuff. Is there any good uses of this? You did this comma and then this variable name.
Yep, and Phil actually just posted it there in the chat window. But yeah, there is a good use for it. It stops the collection objects from being enumerated.
I first encountered this when doing a get child item where I didn't specify either files or directories, and so putting that through get member shows me a files type and a directory type.
Yep, because it doesn't flatten the collection. So now it says, okay, every different object type, let's display something, which is what you see here for that collection, where you see that I have the system string and I also have ints in there. And this is what we this is what we defined.
This is crazy stuff, man. I'm enjoying this so much. I feel like this is stuff that's been right under my nose and I never knew it was there. I mean, I knew some of it, but not to this level of detail.
That's cool. Well, I'm gonna continue because now the cool stuff is gonna come up. So now if I go back to custom object 3, I'm actually gonna use some of these. So we clear the host. I'm gonna do custom object. I'm gonna pass it to get member, and I want to do a force on this. And I want, oh, let me do. Okay, so what I did, and I'll go back to this. I dumped out my custom object 3. So you'll notice here, my custom object only just contains key and a value. I go to subreference the PS type names, and I also pass that to get member. And what that is showing me is that there are, of this type system string, there are some methods here. And if you notice, when I had said earlier, when you have an object that you have methods, they allow you to take actions on an item. What I'm doing is I'm calling the insert method off of the PS type names object that's associated with custom object 3. And if I dump this out, you'll notice that it was an object and I extended it. And now I'm going to call the insert method. And I'm going to insert that, my custom object 33, which was a typo. And you'll see that it's there. Now, subsequently, I can also call the remove because I made a mistake. I got to just remove element 0. See if it got rid of it. All right, there we go. I had a typo somewhere. Oh, okay. Yeah, be careful when you do this. If you're calling the remove, these are case sensitive. You'll notice here where I did the cut and paste, it had a capital C before it didn't. And this will return true or false. So now if I go back to the type name, you can see that I've actually removed it from the type names table. And now I can go back and I can fix that and add it back here. Okay, so now this custom object has a name. That's great. But so now what does this do? Well, now, as I mentioned before, you have to let me take a step back right to the beginning again of this object creation so we can see this since we got off a little bit. I'm going to pull up my custom object. And for the type names, I added this type, my custom object. If I dump this custom object out, I just get a list. That's not cool. I don't like that. So what I'm going to do is I want to update this on the fly for this session. So I'm going to call update type data, and the type name is the one that I want to update. In this case, it's my custom object, which matches my custom object. I am defining a default property display set, and I'm saying I want first name and company. The default display property will be first name, and I'm going to put these on there. Okay. Now, what do you guys think is going to happen when I run and dump out my custom object?
Please.
Well, your
First
You
name
see
and
first
company.
name and company.
just those two.
Here you go.
So how would you get the rest now that you've created this custom view?
So I can
It's all
simply-
there, right? It's just hidden.
Ah, yes, that
No,
is
I know
what I
it's-
was thinking. someone
No, I
was
know
gonna
it's all there. That's what I'm saying. How would you get it to display now? Say, I know there's two.
So you just select. You
Uh,
select.
Well, you can just add them back in. If I do a select, remember I'm going to toss away that object. Now I could totally do this. I could say new equals my custom object, and select object, and then say I want date and last name, two totally different things. I still have my custom object. If I could type, and there's new, but you won't have anything else on new. It's a totally new object. You'll see it's a custom object, and it just contains these two note properties. Now, what I
Yeah,
could
but
do, okay.
I was gonna say, but there's got to be something extra that you haven't gotten to yet because you're saying it's the default display property set. So there's got to be an other view to pull back up the other data.
You can just use asterisks.
Okay. What does that look like?
I just did it right on the screen. You'll see everything comes out here.
Okay. So that's a format table. Okay.
Yeah. Now remember that the interesting thing here is that it affects my list and my table, but everything is there. Now I could totally do a select if I wanted to, and you can totally do that. But say you gave me a request and you're like, hey Dave, I need you to add some more stuff. So I go back to the display and I say, all right, let me add last name, and you can update this thing on the fly.
I got you. So that's the magic, or that's the hidden secret, in that because you're just changing the display of the object and not changing the object. And I understand now when you're saying if you start selecting out the different parts, technically you're doing something different.
You're
not
dropping
really-
the data. You're not changing the view. You're actually dropping the data from the output. So I find
Well,
it
effectively, you're
interesting.
creating a new object that is
Yeah.
that is just the parts you're looking for. But assuming that you're holding on to the original data, you're not throwing it away. But if you're doing it in a big format, so yeah, I got you there.
So I'm going to put this on the screen so you guys can see it. It probably would help too. But this is what's happening. So, and let's take out get process. We're just going to substitute it with my custom object, right? In this case, my custom object was a automation system.management.automation.ps custom object. That's holding my information. Now, I passed it down the pipeline, right? We did a pipe and we did FT and we said, show us everything. So what happens is right before it gets to the screen, this is where that formatting engine goes through and says, is there a predefined view? Well, we do have a predefined view because we ran update type data, and we said, and originally show us first name and date. And so that's what it returned. If that wasn't there, in this case for system process, this wouldn't be here because that's not predefined. We have a user defined view, which is the second one. So we go to that. And then we just go down the selection. If there's no user defined, but there was a system process, then we see if we have a default display property set. Now, in our user view, we also have a default. And since that's there, that takes precedence because we said initially, we just want to update the type data, and this is our default display property set. So that is what we are going to print, and that's what is given to outhost, and that's what shows up on the console.
So one of the things that I find interesting about this is that I do custom objects a lot when I make some functions to output basically a custom view, right? But I've always thought of a custom object as let me make the object be what I want to see on the screen instead of, well, maybe I want to collect a whole bunch of data and let me just customize what people could see in the default view.
Yep. Now, and just to show you this, if I write, here's my custom, my custom object, here is the 3 that we defined, but I can still show you that everything's still there. I can still construct whatever formatting I want because those note properties still exist as metadata on that object.
So you're going to blow my mind here a second. I think we saw it, some of it, is that I looked in that typing for the feature type, and it did you could effectively change the format to dynamically create content for you, couldn't it?
Yeah. And if you notice, I was going to show you this later on. We don't have too much more here, but I was going to show you how to do it for a module. But when you create a view, let's say, for example, I have one for jobs, and there's a data field. Here's the data field here. Your table, let me see if I can get enough screen, and I'm going to open these up as well. You have your table headers, which have to have the names, right? If you notice, my first one doesn't have a name. I'm just saying align these to the center. When I denote it with the label, if the first one is center, so you see I have this one, and then I have name. If I look down here, you see I have index, and then this, instead of name, it's the script block. And so this is where I'm using that script block. When we do the format, we look at this table column and we go, hey, there's a script block here. What are we doing? And I'm basically saying, take the name, and in my case, I'm saying if the length is greater than 15, then I want you to chop it down to construct a smaller view and then just put ... on it. This script block can be any code that you want to create and that you want to do on your formatting. So if you were pulling back something from a drive and it had to do with drive space and you wanted to do some funky calculations to it, you can put that in a script block, and when that finishes processing, that's what's going to get put to the screen.
So I think the magic there is just exactly what you just said, and you're doing it all in the formatting format.
Correct.
And so the real data is just a freaking number. But if
That's
you
all it is.
send it out to a table, it comes out in the form you want. But ultimately, it's this, the number of ticks from like last password set. It's ticks. I'm like, who the hell's going to make anything that goes ticks? But I want to see it in the date form.
Yes, absolutely. This is it, right? The PowerShell formatting engine, his whole job is to say, how do you want to see this data? And then it just goes to look to see if there was predefined or a user custom. And if there is, that's its job, is to display that to the console.
Interesting.
Now there's some other cool things that you can do. I don't know how many people here. I'm a contributor to PS Framework. If anybody has had the opportunity to see Frederick's presentation on PS Framework, if you think this will blow your mind, that'll absolutely you'll have an aneurysm. But there's so many cool things, like, say for example, I want to do my custom object, and I can do select PSF object, and I can say first name as I can just do custom formatting on the fly while I'm retaining the object. One of the things that he does in PS Framework is he's very big on object retention. So if I had, for example, in Mike's case, Mike does a lot of AD stuff. When you make calls to Active Directory, that data has to be serialized. If you're asking for computer names, 9 out of 10 times the computer names coming back, like if you're looking for domain controllers, are going to be deserialized. PS Framework, he has methods in there that retain the original objects, so you can have serialization and still be able to do customizations on objects. So I could do other things, like you can do get date, and this would show you the date, and then I could format this and change the numbers. I can change drive sizes on the fly to say calculate it to any number, and it'll calculate it.
It's cool.
I've got an interesting question. If you or is there a way to change the format on outputting CSV data so that numeric fields are not quoted, not treated as strings?
So if I know how to do it in PS Framework, I haven't done it. I've cheated. I use PS Framework to do it because he has some methods in there that basically allow you to collapse the objects, so that way you can print them out in CSV. But typically anything that gets printed out to an out file or CSV, if it's a string, it's going to have the marks on it.
Well, is it doing it really inside the formatter, or is it using the export CSV commandlet, and that's doing the work?
Yeah, that's the last one that it's going to run through. So before you actually have it outputted, if you're exporting it, that data is being manipulated, and then it's just being displayed. Now, these views, these are going to be the views that you see on the screen. When you go to out file, it's going to be a little bit different. If you were to do a select object and you were to select it, then you're creating a new object, then you're going to see what's, you're going to get specifically in the view.
So nothing in the output CSV would be affected by this?
I believe that you would end up having, no, you'll get the fields, but if you did, say, some custom programming here to like add commas or to remove commas, those should be gone because you're processing it. And that's something you'd have to just, you'd have to test out. Because you could put a command in there to strip out commas, quotes, and things like that. All right, you guys ready to see the magic and see how to actually create it and do it?
Come on, I'm super excited. Let's go.
All right, so that's just on the fly, right? So we have the object, everything's there. I'll go back to that later. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. So I am going to open up. Let's see if this is there. I built my machine, and that's not there, but I have it in my project. So let me see. Where we are. If I still have it. Here it is right here. Okay. So I didn't have it on Notepad, but because I just rebuilt this machine, but I always save my stuff. So if I go back to the presentation, you'll see here that I already had, I didn't have it on the Notepad, or I didn't have it dumped out, but I have it in the project. So what I did was I went and got the XML, and I just basically called it my custom object. So here's my custom object. Here's the type name and the table columns, right? And I'm just putting them all to the center. And I defined the table rows. So I want to see first name, last name, date, city, very generic. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this work, I got to put this in a notepad real quick. Oops. Work. All right, I'm going to save that. So what I'm going to do now is I have the data in Notepad. Let me just open it up, make sure it opens up. Cool. All right, it's there. So here's my XML view. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to update my format view on the fly. And let's see what happened here. Oh, then it would help if I actually saved it. ps1.xml. And what happened? It looks like the formatting got messed up from Notepad. So let me do this again real quick. Do this in Notepad++. And you got to be careful with that. Sometimes Notepad will strip things out. All right. Back to presentation. Go down here. Make sure this opens up the right way. Okay, that looks much better. All right. So now I ran update format data. So before we ran update type data where we created the default display property set. Now I'm creating my view. And now if I go and dump out my custom object, there's my table. I can also dump it out in the list, and the list, now, did you guys notice something different that happened there?
Yeah, there's only 3 properties there.
Right. We created a table view. We didn't create a list view. So if I go back and I look at the standard members for my custom object, we're only saying that just the very first default is first name. But if I go back, we can see that when we went to print my custom object, now that we updated the formatting data based on this format file, which looks like this, and we're saying give us first name, last name, date, and all of this, right? You guys still with me?
Yep.
We are printing that out, but because my custom object only has a table view associated with it, not a list, when we ask for the list, it goes back and says whatever objects are there, and it sees that we have that default display property set, which is first name, last name, and company.
Mm. but all the other stuff is there. It's just not just being displayed.
Yep, still there. So if I go back here and I do a get member, there's all my stuff there. First name, company, date, which I can clearly go and do, this formatting, and there's all the stuff there. Now, I could do something like, say I want to update this again, and I want to do, I don't like name. Let's just say today's date. All right. I'm going to save that. Actually, I'm saving that in the program. That's not going to help. So let me switch back to Notepad real quick. And we'll just make this today's date. Save it. I'm going to open this back up just to make sure that it didn't get messed up. Okay, we look good. We can see that the changes are there, right? Yep. And now I'm going to update on the fly. Now I'm going to run my custom object again. Now, you will notice, and I do definitely want to point out, when you go to make changes like this, it is critical that everything match. And the reason why I did this on purpose was, if you notice that in my custom object, the object is actually first name, last name. So now we have an issue, because when we're going to display, then we end up running into that issue. So this object has already been created. So there's an easy fix around that. What we do is we put these back. And we go up to the top.
Oh, so you're just labeling them differently.
Yep. And that's how you get around that.
So at this point here too, you're creating a new label, but it's like the first. You have to just keep them in the right entry rows, right? Because how does it know that
they have to be. If they're not, then you're gonna run into issues, and then the data is gonna not come out the way that it's supposed to. So I just save that, and if I don't have any issues here, it's did not save.
I think you need to update again.
Yeah, let me save it again. Oh, it's already open. Close this here. Let me close this one here.
That's the one that's open.
There, let's do it here.
Oh, so now I see it. It's because that's in a table control. And so
Yes.
those tables entries and those table headers are different, and that's where the matching happens.
Yep.
Okay, I got it now.
So we do first, and I only have to do two. That's all I really need to do. Let's save that back. Oh. Helps me actually type them the right way. And now I've effectively still have the same view, but I've changed it. So my view now shows first and last, and I can change these to whatever I want. But if I go and look at my object, you'll notice that the original is still first name. So I've just changed the view. So maybe this is the object that I got, but Mike is in HR and Mike's like, hey, the data that you're sending to me really doesn't work for me because I can't import this. Maybe he's taking it and just doing a cut and paste from the screen and needs it to say first, or he's cutting it and pasting it, putting it in, clipping it into an Excel spreadsheet. So this is how you can start to customize that data on the fly.
So to also Don's point is that you could be very gentle when you do some of that, because effectively now that the output table is different, has a different property type or header than the actual type. So
yeah, my suggestion is that you always have it match. If you want to mess around with stuff and test it, I would say for production environments, always have them match, because it's very easy for somebody, you could put a comment in VS Code and say, don't touch. We'll just, destroy view or something like that.
Yeah. Cool.
Now I'll show you how to duplicate these, and then I'll do it in a module. So if I dump out for each, and what else is not working here? Did I forget to? Yeah. Okay. So earlier I ran Git process, and I created a couple jobs. And now here I'm going to allude to how I created the one for my module. Now, if the way it works for a module is that in a session, you run update format data type and you run update type data. In a module, what you want to do is you want to have the module name .format.ps1xml, which should reside in your XML directory. You only want to have one of these. You don't want to have multiple files. The recommendation is to create one, and then you could put multiple objects in there. So you could see here I have one for jobs and one for sessions. And then the types, this is just, for me, this is just a regular custom PS framework or PS module development module creation. So there's really nothing here. I'm not using the types file. I'm just using the format. And then what you have to do is in your, where's my other files? In your PSD1 file, you have to make sure that you specify the formats to process, and you want to point it to that format XML. So what happens is at runtime, when you do a IPMO, or that's the alias for import module, and it imports it, it looks at the formats to process, and PowerShell says, go to the XML directory and load this format file into this PowerShell session, which essentially runs the update format type data and pulls your views into the cache table so you have them. Now, one thing to note about that, if you're doing custom programming and you have a module and you make changes to your format file and you're not working in VS Code where you can just hit the garbage can and wipe out your session and start a new one, but you're doing your programming, your testing in PowerShell, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to save your file and re-import that module again with the force command to make sure that your view works. Don't get that confused, and that's important to remember, because if you run an update type or update format data, you're updating it on the fly for your local session. You're not using the module import. So it's very easy with testing to kind of get that, get that mixed up. Have a great night, Dave. And so now what I'll do is I'm going to hop back over here. We only have just a little bit left. We're just about done. Let me scroll over. Let's close this one. Close that one. All right. So what I'm going to do is you can run the command get type data. And what this is going to do is, since we're working on a job object, I want to dump out all of the job objects. So by doing get type data, you can do this for any type, and it will dump those out for you. What I'm really concerned about here is the management automation job. So what I want to do is I'm going to do a get format data, the type name, which I'm looking for. In this case is the system management automation job, and I'm going to export that. That'll export that out, and then what I'm going to do is I wrote a command, oops, and it's going to dump it out. You just have to paste it in. So what I did was I just created a template off of the automation job, and this is how I created the job one that I use in production for myself, and I'll show that to you. But you just run the get format data, and then you just pipe that, and there's your object. You're never touching the original one. You can now go and change the type name, and you can change the column width headers, and you now have an object that you can work with. So I'm going to clear my host, and I'm going to show you, this is get job. This is what I ran in the beginning to set up the session, just to have some data here. So I created some background jobs, some workflow, remote job. And for my get job type, this is what I have come back. So for me, I find it incredibly frustrating when I'm working with jobs and I run a receive job and I end up throwing the data away because I didn't use the keep command. So what I have done was I wrote a custom function, which is get job type. I gave it an alias, and I created a custom object, which you saw earlier. And I gave it the type name, PS utilities, job, which is in the format file right here. And then you'll notice I do have some customization. So up in the table headers, I have the name and the data fields. And down below in the table columns, this is where I have the custom programming that cuts down so I can get more on the screen. And you can see that here. So, you know, the get process was definitely more. And I have a data field. I like to do stuff by index. So if I run jobs, I've pulled them back. I can easily look at job1.data, and there's all my mailbox data. And I have my mailbox users, and I've still retained the data because in my get job, I run keep and receive job. So I've essentially just created my own custom job with the data that I want to see. I've also done the same thing in my module with sessions. So this is what the regular session looks like, right? Not too, not too user friendly. This is what mine returns. And so I can pull back supported versions, and I can start to dig down to things where I'm troubleshooting connections to remote hosts to see what type of protocols they're using, and so forth. And then if I decide to dump out lists, you'll notice that these just look they look disgusting, right? You have the state idle times. I like to see a little bit more detailed information. So I've changed these views. Is it available? Are we using proxy? Do we have compression? And I wanted to see stuff in hours and minutes. So, again, in my custom object, this is where I start to dig around and I look to see what the session is. If you dig around in the PS base application private data, you can see like the supported versions for remoting. Those are in there. And then this is where I've done some of my, custom hours based on the, Microsoft docs that are out there to tell me what the idle timeouts should be. And that's pretty much how, I do it in a module, and that's the end of the magic there.
I love that job stuff because the receive and the keep, I hate that crap.
It always gets me. And if you guys if you want it and you want to play around with it, and I'll post it out in the meeting. I put this one out there. Let's see. Where are you?
He's got a few.
I have a couple. And you can pull down that module in there, and it'll show you the functions, and it has both the get job types and get module path, get sessions, and then it has the XML files in there as well. So that way you can just load this module up and then you can see it work and then start playing around with it. Yeah, if you could definitely have some issues if you run into overriding a PS custom object, but if you have the type name set, you're pretty much going to be good to go. It's the only time that you would really run into that is if you have multiple component teams working on the same code base. You really shouldn't run into that issue if someone else is consuming your code, because you're going to end up running that in your PowerShell session on your box. There's really no need to send these remote to do the views, because any type of remoting, you're pulling that data back to your local machine.
Dave, this is awesome stuff tonight.
Dude, went so deep and just enough where blew my mind. It was good job, Dave.
I appreciate. I tried to keep it as simple as I could. Yeah, I know we have a lot of experienced guys on the phone. I hope I didn't lose anyone. If I definitely have time to hang around if you guys want to do some stuff, or if you want to share your screen if you're stuck on something. Definitely here to help you guys, work with this, and hopefully this saves you some time, in your day to day.
I think the magic of the fact that even if it did go beyond some people and went over their heads, that we will be recording this, or this is recorded, and this is an opportunity to watch the video again. So it'll be posted up onto YouTube, and watch it as many times in format, and then certainly reach out to me. I think Dave is open to he's on Twitter. Mike and I are on Twitter, so we can certainly assist where people need things, and it's definitely good stuff.
And by the way, I had this little Christmas present for you guys. If anybody cares to debug this process, here's the link on GitHub. You can get the PowerShell, the latest PowerShell code that's out there. These are the breakpoints and the line numbers where you can set them. If you do a search for default display property set, you can set a breakpoint there, and then just if you want to do a simple repro, just do like we did here, create your own custom object and give it a type name, and just create a simple view and set that breakpoint and build your environment and run it. And you can step through the code and you can actually see all 4 of the steps that we're going to run through. They're go through the format view manager, some of the base command stuff, the marshalling, but you can see how all of this works.
Super interesting. Great job.
Any last questions or anything that you guys wanna try?
I had a quick question about using minus or dash is on this, because with PS type names, can you use dash is, or will it recognize that type name? I haven't been able to do it successfully myself, but I was wondering if there is a way to actually have it recognize the object type
with a dash in it.
No, like dash is like to check the object type. It won't validate that the object is that PS type name that you add, like that custom PS type name that you added.
Can you share out your screen so we could see? If you can't, you can just tell me, and I can type it on here, and we can do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, just using. I was kind of running through things a bit earlier.
Dan, I made you a presenter if you want to try to share.
Can you see the screen now or no?
Let me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see. You just have to
Alright,
make
yeah,
it just
so
a tiny bit bigger.
Basically, I was testing this a little bit earlier. The idea being that I would create
Yeah,
my
can you
own.
make it a little bigger?
Yeah.
Sorry. There we go.
Same idea. Created a custom object. Added a custom object type name. It didn't recognize this object type when I'm using minus or dash is like that. And I've tested this before, and I was just wondering if there's a better way of using this with PS type names. So I had to instantiate an object, so I created a quick class, and then testing it, and it's coming back with false. So that's where I'm not sure. The reason for this is I kind of use my own custom object a lot in my modules and pass those objects between the different functions in my module, but I have to instantiate them with a class first, and I'm wondering if I can do it quickly using just like a PS type name and permanent that way. That makes sense.
What is
Yeah,
the dash?
that's-
What does the dash is do? I'm not familiar with that.
So yeah, what I'll end up using this for is I end up using this to check to see a specific object type is either a string object or an object from something within my own module. Like if so, I have a bunch of modules for something around like let's say ServiceNow. So I have an object that's a ServiceNow incident, and I can either take in the incident number as a string, and I'm just pulling in any type of object, and then I do the validation within my function itself on whether it's a string object or whether it's a object type that I've created within my module itself. But the only way I can see doing it is I have to have custom classes, building and instantiating the object.
Yeah, most likely for that is because the class object exists in memory, where when you're doing the is, it's looking for an object to compare it against. It's not actually referencing the type table.
Yeah.
Can you use reflections and just instantiate it as? Can you put like the type class in front of it, instead of the that line right there where it says basically right there, cannot convert my object from type string to system type. Can you just use reflections and cast that name into an object that type?
I thought the type had to be defined by the square brackets. You can't do it with the quotes, and that's why it's saying test is this, and you can't convert that to string or stripe type.
Right, yeah.
But if you simply use like reflections and put it back in front of it, so put square my document of the other one.
Sorry, where?
So, I guess it says it can't find that type, so it wouldn't even work. So it's the one above it won't work. So you put square braces my custom object, then followed by quote of my object.
Right.
So my object of that type, and it doesn't. It's trying to create that of that type, but that type doesn't exist. And so, but you're creating the class, right? And so
yeah, I created it down here and then tested again. But that's what I was wondering is even though this object that I created has that PS type name, not technically recognizing it as the same type.
After you defined it as a class, did you put test is with the square brackets around my custom object?
Yeah, I did. I thought, well, so this still is the same one. My custom object.
No.
Huh. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen this like in my script writing, so that's why I was wondering if it's just I'm not looking in the right place. There is a better way of doing, and I mean, I guess I could validate based off of PS type names objects and see, if they contain.
That's from my understanding, working with the PowerShell team, that's the actual best way to do it, is to do it off the get type full name.
Okay.
At least when I'm looking at code, those are the references that I see there.
Misspelled object.
Yeah.
Or maybe what Josh King threw in there is. You see what he typed in?
No, I closed it.
So $test.get type name, get type.
Oh, does that work?
Yeah. .get type. .name. Yeah.
Josh is cheating.
Now, I will tell you one way you can do
Oh,
it.
still false.
No. Here's how you do it. Type in my custom object. But you have to do it. You have to do it off the full name. So, no. I'm sorry. Go back. Do $sign my custom object.
Sorry.
.test.
The variable.
Or create a new custom object without creating a class.
Okay.
All right. Then do $test2 -is. And then in brackets, you got to put the full type name. So it's going to be system management automation PS custom object.
Well, yeah, but that wouldn't, I guess.
It's going to pull the object type off the full name. Those are the ways that I also see that we do it as well. The type name, underlying, it's still a PS custom object. The type name is only just a link that you gave to that object.
Right. So it kind of only exists within the current session, or
current session. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Ultimately, if that object's getting marshaled, it's still a PS custom object. That's what PowerShell sees it as. Anytime you extend it, that's all it is. Now you can add a type name to it. The type name can be whatever you want. Type name is not going to get used unless you're going to use it for like a view or something like that.
Okay, cool.
But at the end of the day, PowerShell just sees it as a custom object.
Got it. Okay. Makes sense.
So thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I want to thank Dan Goldman for presenting tonight. Really fantastic presentation, deep dive on object formatting and some of the really, really interesting things that you could do. As always, check out the YouTube channel for more, and we'll see you soon.